All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Bob Bruner. I am the exotic forest pest educator with Purdue University's Department of Entomology, and this is the Emerald Ash Borer University. This is a program that is done in partnership with Purdue University, Michigan State University, and The Ohio State University. And my colleagues who work with me on this project are Sheila Babbitt and Kayla Perry from Michigan State and Ohio State, respectively. Today, we are hosting Dr. Caleb Wilson, who's going to be talking to us about ash regeneration, something that I know I give a lot of talks on, and I know people have a lot of questions about. So I'm looking forward to learning along with you today. So, Caleb, please feel free to take it away.
All right, thanks, Bob. Just feel free to interrupt me if the audio cuts out at any point. I'm using wireless headphones, but hopefully it should be good all the way through. So thanks for coming, folks. We're going to be talking about ash regeneration, as Bob mentioned at the top, and then I've got my co-authors here listed on this slide. So I'm going to present some work that I did when I was a postdoc at Michigan State as part of my research up there. I then only worked there for about a year before I got my current job at UK down here in Kentucky. But a lot of this work was done after I left there by some really hardworking folks up at the Forest Service lab up there. So I'll talk about how all that pans out later on. And I'm also going to do a bit of review about the broader literature about this topic of ash regeneration to place the study that we did in the context of what other people are doing throughout these parts of the country where EAB has been present for a really long time. And let's see, hopefully this doesn't get frozen on the first slide. There we go. Okay, so as I mentioned, I've moved to University of Kentucky after doing the project that I'm going to be speaking to you about. And at my lab at UK, we're an urban landscape entomology lab, so we study insects in the urban environment, outdoors, not indoors. So we do a lot of work with scale insects in landscape trees. I'm still doing some projects with emerald ash borer because it is still a pest down here in the landscape just as well as in our forests. And then more recently, we're branching out and doing some work with annual bluegrass weevil, which is a big pest on golf courses in our region of the Upper South. Oh, and I should mention that's my lab website there. I'll show it again at the end of this presentation if you're interested in reading more about the work we do and about this project in particular that I'll be presenting on. So I know everybody here is familiar with this insect. We are just going to do a quick refresher, and I promise it won't be too painful to refresh about everything we know about EAB. As you all know, it's a very devastating invasive pest that first arrived in Detroit in the late 90s, but it wasn't detected until 2002. And then since its arrival, millions of ash trees across North America have been killed by this beetle. And of course, it's not the pretty adults that do most of the damage. It's really these larvae, as you can see on the bottom right there, that wind their way through the inner workings of a tree. And then you end up with trees that, when you peel the bark back, have a bunch of these galleries all throughout the phloem where the beetles have fed. So EAB's life cycle is pretty straightforward. Now we are getting to the point where they are all pupae and getting ready to start emerging from trees, depending on where you live. If you're up in, let's say, Michigan, the adults are going to emerge in, early to early to mid-June, depending. So basically, we always just say early summer is when those adults start emerging, start flying around, mating, laying eggs, and that whole thing. And then, so those eggs are laid in the summer, and then once those eggs hatch, the larvae are going to wind their way into the trunks and branches of trees where they'll start feeding on the phloem inside the tree. And so that's a picture there of a fourth instar larva doing its thing. And then those larvae are going to feed all throughout the summer, all the way through the fall until it basically gets too cold for them to move around much more. And at that point, they're going to sit in place and overwinter within those trees, not really doing much, just hanging out because it's too cold to do anything. And then the following spring, those larvae are going to get bigger. They're going to drill their way deeper into the trees, create these pupal chambers where they will pupate. And that's an example there of what an EAB pupa looks like. And then again, they'll get ready to emerge later on in early summer. So what's also interesting while we're talking about this is that the further north you are in the US, you're more likely to find a mixture of 1 and 2 year life cycles, meaning that there are some larvae, if you're up in, let's say, Michigan, for example, that are going to they're going to hang out in the tree for an additional year before they emerge, while some of them will do this 1 year life cycle as I diagrammed it here and will emerge the following spring. But if you go further south into the country, where I'm at in central Kentucky, the majority of the EAB down here actually have a 1 year life cycle where they do all of this in 1 year. But there is still some of them that will hang out in the trees for an additional year. So just an interesting aside. Now, when it comes to recognizing EAB damage, the most obvious symptom, as we all know here, is this thinning appearance of trees that have been damaged. The dieback starts from the top of the tree and works its way down. And generally speaking, once a tree gets up beyond 30% dieback in the canopy, it's usually beyond the point at which an insecticide treatment will aid that tree and address the infestation. Other things that stand out a lot are these suckers, or what we call formally as epicormic sprouts that come out from the trunk of the tree. And then, of course, those tunnels that you can see underneath the bark, those galleries where the bark is kind of peeled off from the trunk of the tree, and you can see the winding galleries underneath, are very clear signs of infestation. And then, of course, these D-shaped exit holes, but I usually don't really emphasize looking for these all that much because they're very tiny, very hard to see, and these other symptoms are much more obvious than the exit holes. But nonetheless, if you have a really infested tree, you're bound to find a couple of those on the trunk. Now, this is the current range map for EAB, at least in the US. This is data pulled directly from Aphis. They have a website where they track county level occurrences across the country from year to year. So you can see in the purple color and the maroon color occurrences from 2025 and 26. And what we see is that basically at all the extremities of EAB's range, it's still expanding, still finding new ash to infest and continuing to spread elsewhere. Where we're seeing a lot of it showing up is in places like Texas, northern Maine, and then in Minnesota as well. The folks on the West Coast are really concerned about this insect as well because it's now shown up in Oregon. There are ash out there as well as crops that EAB can infest, namely olive trees, which we'll talk about in a minute as well. In Canada, I had to go to a different website to find the map for Canada, so that's why the colors are different here. These are just showing you occurrences, and basically EAB has been found in Ontario and New Brunswick. It's very likely going to show up in Quebec at some point in the future, but that's where it is so far in Canada. Now, if you think about how far EAB might spread in the future, this is a map from Aphis showing all the places in the United States where we have the ash trees growing, just the genus, not necessarily any particular species. We're kind of aggregating that all together in this green color. So they've estimated where they suspect ash is located, but they might not necessarily have data for. So that's the lighter green. And then the darker green is where they have actual data about where ash is located. And so at the time that this map was created, all those red dots were EAB detections. That obviously has expanded since this map was created. But really the more interesting thing here is all the potential places further west and further south in the country where EAB can still continue to spread. So unfortunately, this is a critter that we are going to continue to have to deal with for far into the future, and is very likely going to continue spreading year after year. As I also mentioned, EAB can damage other things, not just ash, but thankfully it's really only these two things that have been found to be other hosts that they can complete development in. White fringe tree is one that you could find, in places throughout the Midwest as an ornamental, sometimes growing in the woods as well. The larvae can kill these trees, but generally speaking, they are a much poorer host for the insect than ash. So it takes more larvae, it takes a longer period of time for them to kill these plants, and they generally don't prefer them over ash. So if you've got ash anywhere nearby, they're typically going to prefer that over these plants. And then cultivated olives are another host that they can develop within. But again, they're a poorer host, so the plants are a little more resistant than ash is, but the larvae can still kill these plants, which of course is a concern for the folks that are growing this as a crop out in California. So, the question that I'd like to get at today with today's presentation is what has happened to ash in our forests? EAB has been in this country for a long time now. Our initial estimates of what happened when EAB was first swept through the country looked very apocalyptic about what we thought would happen. And so I'm going to give you a balanced view of how things have changed over time and what we can expect in the future. So starting off, I'm going to talk about this research study that was published in 2014, but their data were collected in southern Michigan, southeastern Michigan, and throughout Ohio around the time when EAB was first detected and started spreading from its initial location in Detroit. And so these are the years they collected data at a ton of different forests all throughout these two states. And then they did a lot of characterization of the trees that were present in these forests. They looked at the health of the canopy, and then they did a lot of work looking at the number of seedlings growing up from the understory, as well as just the number of seeds present in a chunk of soil from soil probe samples. So these graphs are very scary. And obviously, if you see something like this, you might think that ash has no chance in North America. But I promise, it's not as bleak as these graphs might make things look out to be. Starting with this graph on the left here, we have the percentage mortality of ash trees in all the places that they studied. Or sorry, these data are just from Michigan that they're plotting here. And what they found is that as time goes on, as EAB got more and more established, they saw super duper high rates of mortality in the ash that they were surveying. And so, it got as high as 99.7% mortality within those stands that they were monitoring in 2009. And then on your right here, these graphs are showing the number of seeds that they found within the soil at different soil types at the sites that they sampled. So xeric being our driest soils, mesic being in between, and then hydric being the wettest soils. And what's concerning here is that it looks like everything just kind of dropped off the cliff when you get to 2007 and 2008, where there's basically no seeds in the soil. But we're going to talk a little bit more about that and how to think about those numbers. The good news is that 2008 was a mast year for ash, meaning that the trees produced tons of seeds all at once and lots of seeds rained down in that year. And so on this graph here, they're showing you the number of seedlings on a per hectare basis. And on the bottom here, they have the mean canopy rating of the trees in each of these stands. So basically, if you're a 5, the majority of the trees in that location were pretty much totally dead. Whereas on a 1 here on the far opposite end of the spectrum, the majority of the trees are happy and healthy. And then all the other numbers are kind of somewhere in between. And what we see here with these bars, the black bar being 2008, is that there's very little seedlings popping up from the understory on a per hectare basis. But when we look at 2009, the numbers jump up dramatically because all these seeds rained down in 2008, started growing from the understory. So yes, while there are very few seeds popping up where the majority of the trees were dead, where we have a lot of dieback still and the trees are barely hanging on and that 4 rating here, we still have pretty good numbers of the number of seedlings popping up on a per hectare basis. And I know these numbers can be hard to wrap your head about around because 30,000 is a large number. And of course, we're talking about a hectare, which is also a very large tract of land. But nonetheless, bigger numbers are better here because it just ultimately means that more of these seedlings are popping up. When we also look at the number of new seedlings, so they measured both the new seedlings and established seedlings in the study. They don't have a graph for this, so unfortunately, I just have to show you the table here. The top graph is the different years, the different soil types that we talked about, and the number of new seedlings for Michigan, and then the bottom is for Ohio. And I just looked all the way to the right here because that's where you see the starkest difference in 2010. At Ohio, they got a lot more new seedlings popping up from the understory, whereas in Michigan, it looks really bleak because very, very low numbers across the board. And this is partly related to the fact that when they were sampling in Ohio around this time, EAB had not gotten fully established in all of these sites. So the numbers look pretty typical, very high regeneration because, we had a 2008 was our mast year, tons of seeds rained down, and then we had lots of stuff popping up. So, it's very concerning to see these low numbers for Michigan in contrast to where EAB is not fully established yet. And then this is another graph, a similar graph. This time we're just looking at established seedlings. These are seedlings that have been around for a couple of years. So even though, if we look at 2010 again here, even though the number of new seedlings was very low in Michigan, we still have tons and tons of these established seedlings that are still around and part of the understory. So, this gives us a little bit of hope, but it is also concerning because we saw that the new crop that's coming up is super duper low, but we still have all of these guys from before EAB arrived that are not dead yet. And the reason they're not dead yet is because they're too young, too small in diameter for EAB to develop within. And then, of course, the concern is, well, when these trees get bigger, are they just going to get clobbered by EAB and die? And that's where things get a little tricky and a little more complicated, as we'll talk about as we go forward here. So, the other thing I'll just mention here too, before I go on further, because I don't want to leave you guys hanging, this stuff with the no viable seeds in 2007 and 2008 on this rightmost graph, it does look really scary, but what they think is going on here and that they talk about in the study is that ash seems to be a species where all the seeds kind of come down at once, things start to regenerate, and then the seed bank is depleted until the next mast year when the next dumping of seeds rains down from the canopy. So that's likely what we're seeing when we hit the x-axis here and nothing is coming up. Now, obviously, EAB killing trees is contributing to this effect, but nonetheless, just because we hit the x-axis and there's nothing in the seed bank doesn't mean that we're not going to get more seeds in the future when the surviving trees reproduce and produce seeds for the next generation. So that was kind of what happened when EAB first got here in this part of the country. Our study was done in central Michigan, many years later, and we did these surveys at 4 forests in central Michigan and all counties surrounding East Lansing, so roughly south central Michigan. And we did this at forests where EAB had been present for about 20 years at that time, give or take a couple of years, depending on the site. And we did all these surveys in 2022 and 23. So we created these grids over these sites like you can see right here. So this is an example site with a 50 by 50 meter grid over it. And then we did surveys in all of this of all the cells of this grid that had at least 4 ash trees that were alive that we could monitor for condition on. And they had to be trees that were bigger than 3 centimeters in diameter, which is approximately about an inch or so. So we measure regeneration in these cells, and that image on the right there, the far right, that's just showing you the schematic for our survey. So that circular radius and the radial plot in the center is for measuring our overstory trees and our recruits. So the recruits are the young trees that are going to become part of the overstory when they get bigger. Those squares represent locations where we counted seedlings, and then the lines descending from the circle in perpendicular directions, that's where we also counted overstory trees and recruits, but we just tallied them instead of measuring them directly. So we did all this, and then we measured the health of 4 randomly selected trees in each of those cells that had enough ash to do our surveys. And these had to be trees bigger than 3 centimeters in diameter. And then I will say too at the top, in these stands, about a third of our trees were green ash and about 2/3 of them were white ash. So if you were to characterize these stands, you would say that they're predominantly white ash stands. So this is just showing you a cartoon about what the different strata looked like and how we quantified them, just because I don't really have great pictures to show you what I mean here. But overstory tree is pretty explanatory. They're the biggest size class. They're the things that fall in the top layer of the forest. Our recruits are the next size class down. They're always a little bit below the overstory trees, but when they get bigger, they're going to become a part of that overstory. Our saplings are, very thin, wispy little trees, but they are bigger than 45 centimeters in height. So, about 1.25 feet, give or take. And then our seedlings are the smallest size class, where they're just smaller than 45 centimeters, which is roughly on me, that's about knee height, but, fairly small, close to the ground with only about a couple of leaves, if that. So here's some of our results here. These are data from 2022 on the left graph. And what we're showing you here is the amount of dieback in each one of our sites. So these abbreviations here are just our 4 different forests. And then we have all the sites together on the left grouping of bars. And our strata here are divided into the overstory in the pale gray color and the recruits in the darker color. And as you might expect, the bigger trees generally had more dieback. That makes sense. Bigger trees, they've been alive longer. They've been of the size that EAB can infest for a longer period of time. They're easier for the beetles to find. So generally speaking, they always have a little bit more dieback at pretty much all the sites that we sampled at. And then when we look at our data for 2023, it's the same thing. At some sites, the difference between these two strata was not statistically significant, but when analyzed across the overall across all sites, it is a noticeable difference where we're talking about an extra 15 to 20% percentage points or so of dieback in the canopy of the overstory trees. Now, when we look at the actual numbers of trees that we found, these are counts of stems over a hectare basis. This first graph here, we've got our two biggest strata, our overstory trees. And again, we're separating with the same colors between dead and living ones, and our recruits with the living and dead ones. And what's noticeable here is that we got way more of those recruits, which makes sense. They're, a younger size class. They haven't lived as long. They're not as likely to have been killed by things. But what's really stark is when you look at the overstory trees, there's no difference statistically in the number of living and dead ones, which means, basically half of our overstory trees are alive, half of them are dead. Whereas if you look at the recruits, it's much less. It's something like 15% or so of those recruits are dead, while the majority of them are alive. And, we're seeing lots of stems here. That's good news. Lots of little trees that are hopefully going to become big trees. On the right here, these are our sapling and seedling strata. And again, this trend continues where we have very few dead saplings. And basically, we didn't bother trying to count dead seedlings because when the tree is, less than an inch tall, telling that it's even an ash is a bit of a struggle. And then when you have a dead little twig sticking out of the ground, telling that it's a dead ash twig is a Herculean task that I wouldn't wish on anybody. So we just counted seedlings as living, and we just counted all the living ash seedlings and didn't worry about the dead ones. So anyhow, the point here is that we're getting lots of regeneration, lots of stuff is popping up. That's great. But unfortunately, when the trees get really big, we see this really dramatic shift in that just as many of them are alive as there are dead ones. And then here we have these same data, but plotted in terms of basal area. So you can think, if you're not familiar with basal area, you can just think of it as the amount of tree diameter within a forest stand. And so here we have for both strata on our first paired graph, and then our overstory trees followed by our recruits. And again, we're seeing the same trend that overall, the majority of the ash diameter in these stands is living. That's good news. But when we look at the overstory trees, just as much of it is living as it is dead, so fairly 50-50 there. And then with our recruits, more of it is alive than dead. But what's interesting is that, the recruits are contributing substantially to the total amount of ash diameter in these forests, which means, again, we got a lot of little trees and not too many of the big trees. In a normal forest where we don't have a chronic invasive pest, we would expect to see that overstory bar there be much bigger because even though you might have fewer overstory trees, they're generally much, much bigger in diameter. And so they contribute much more to basal area, but that's not necessarily what we're seeing here. And then here on the right graph, it's the same data set, but we're plotting ash phloem area instead. And so this is basically, we do some math to calculate the amount of ash phloem that's present instead of basal area. And that's because EAB feeds on phloem. So by measuring the amount of phloem, you can estimate how much there is available to feed the beetles in the forest that you're sampling within. And from the data that we collected, there was enough phloem out there in these forests to support nearly 300,000 larvae. So there's plenty of food for these beetles to nibble on, but thankfully not all of it's dead, and there is still a lot of it that's alive. So, some of the big takeaways from this study is that trees are very much more likely to die as they get bigger. What we found is that about half of the ash bigger than 4 inches in diameter were dead. And then that declines as you go down for the subsequent size classes. Those recruits between 1 and 3 inches can be infested by EAB, but they've been in that size class generally for not that long. So that's part of the reason why they don't get infested as much. And also, when there's a big, juicy overstory tree nearby, a beetle is more likely to colonize that than they are these tiny little things that are next to them. And then, for our very little trees, very few of them are dead. Most of the mortality here is probably not related to EAB. It's just other things like deer chewing on them or, a tree falls on top of them or a slew of other things. What's also interesting is that of our white ash, remember I said white ash was the most dominant species that we had here. About over half of them were alive, and we're talking about overstory trees here specifically. So over half of the big ash are alive, which is good news. And then even for green ash, which green ash is generally much more susceptible to EAB, and we had less of it in these stands than the white ash. Most of it, or well, half of it was still alive, which is generally good news, even though it is still fairly high mortality. So this is where I'm going to transition into talking about the differences in ash species and their susceptibility to EAB. So with blue ash, that's our one of our common species in the Midwest and Upper South. This is the most resistant native species in North America to EAB. And then as we go down the list here, white ash has got moderate resistance. Again, another super common species. But trees could definitely be killed by EAB. But there's, as we saw in the study that we did, a lot of them are still out there in the woods regenerating. When we look at green ash, things start to get a little more dire. That's where we see far fewer of them surviving when they get infested. So we would say that they're generally not resistant. And then black ash is the most susceptible of the common ash species in the range where EAB has been present for a while. And it's super duper susceptible to EAB, which is unfortunately really bad news for a lot of reasons. So when black ash gets colonized, it's not very long at all before it just totally dies. And so these are not all the species in North America. There's about 20 or so species of ash in North America, but these are the really common species that are where EAB has been present for a long time. So these are the ones that have been studied the most, and we know the most about how they tend to react both in like a laboratory setting, but also out in the woods when EAB sweeps through and knocks out a lot of the trees. But generally speaking, all the ash in North America are susceptible to EAB to some degree. So there's some common garden experiments that folks have done, which is basically you plant a bunch of these species all together in the same location and look to see how soon they die by EAB, how many larvae are found within there, and things such as that. This is a graph here from a stand that or a planting that was established in 2007. This was at MSU, Central Michigan, so roughly around the time EAB was arriving in that region. And what we see here, the y-axis isn't too interesting here because we're not really interested in DBH. We're just mostly interested in how many lived versus died. So these were data collected in 2022. They were planted in 2007. And what we see is that all of the blue ash after that period of time are still alive. With Chinese ash, even though it's from the part of the world EAB is from, they're still super susceptible to EAB. So lots and lots of those died. With our green ash, it's a little more than half of them died. And then with our white ash, remember, white ash has got some resistance, and actually very few of those died over that period of time. The opposite ends of the spectrum are with the Manchurian ash, which is not graphed here, but it's in a nearby planting. All of those that were when they were established about 12 years later, they were still alive. So Manchurian ash is super resistant to EAB, and it's from the native region, or it's from the part of the world that EAB is from. And then, as I said, with our black ash, just about all of those were dead by 2013, which makes sense because it's the most susceptible species that we've studied thus far in North America. So, down where I live, ash is still a part of the urban landscape. If you live in a state like Michigan, especially close towards Detroit, you're not likely to find any ash at all in the landscape because they all got killed by EAB. But nonetheless, I would say that if you want to plant ash in the landscape, that I think you can still do it. Ash is generally a great landscape tree, and it is a very beautiful genus of trees. But if you do so, you're going to want to plant either Manchurian ash or blue ash because they're both resistant to EAB. The caveat here is that stressed ash are always going to be more susceptible to EAB, but that's also true of lots of other trees that we grow in urban landscapes like maples or honey locusts. If they're stressed out and planted in a bad location and not watered, they're much more attractive to borers. Other species besides EAB can kill landscape trees, so I wouldn't let EAB scare you off from planting some of these more resistant species if you want to plant them. So, the reason I've been talking so much about host plant resistance here is the fact that when you look at ash regeneration in places where EAB has been around for a long time, we see that certain species are surviving much better than others, and it makes sense when you think about how resistant they are. So this is a study that was done in 2015 in central Michigan. So you can think of like the study that we did as kind of being, the most recent. The first study I presented you to being sort of that initial wave when EAB went through the country and then, or at least went through the Midwest. And then this study being kind of in between there at that kind of central point. And so this was done in central Michigan on nearly 30 forested sites. And what they found is that the majority of the overstory white ash were alive, and 83% of them had healthy canopies, meaning less than 30% dieback. So generally, the white ash were looking really good at that time. But when you look at the green ash, it's a much more somber picture of what's going on because 92% of them in these surveys were totally dead. So really good news for white ash, not so much so for green ash. And then they do have some regeneration data as well. Whether or not you care about these numbers probably depends on, the type of work that you do, but nonetheless, lots of regeneration for the white ash in these stands because it was so predominant and the majority of them were very healthy. And then when we look at blue ash, remember I said that blue ash is our most resistant species. It's even more resistant than white ash, and we can actually see this from data that's been collected in Southeast Michigan. So this was around that same time period as the study we just talked about. This was in Southeast Michigan near Detroit. And they did surveys for blue and white ash, and what they found was that a very low percentage of the blue ash were dead, whereas a high percentage of the white ash were dead in this region. So we're talking 60 versus 21%, which is a fairly noticeable difference. They found really strong regeneration for both species too. So regardless of the fact that the big trees are dying a lot, there's still a lot of stuff popping up from the understory. And then we can also visualize this data set by looking at these graphs on the right here. So again, we have the number of stems on our y-axis. These are just pure counts. We're not dividing it by an area or anything. It's just the number of stems that they found in their surveys. And then we have those same crown ratings as before. So a 5 means the tree is dead. 1 means that the tree is generally happy and doesn't have any sign of dieback. And what we see is that the average for blue ash is to be, it's got a little bit of dieback, but it's still doing okay. Whereas the average here for white ash was to be much further along on the right, closer to being a dead tree. So generally what that's saying is that blue ash is even more resistant than white ash and seems to be doing pretty good. Now, unfortunately, this is where we have to get to the bad news. And when we talk about green and black ash, things are much more bleak. This is a study that was done both in the upper Michigan, and then they also did this in central Michigan as well. And so here on this graphic on the left, this is ash phloem area. So again, just the total area of tree that's available for beetles to develop within before EAB swept through this site in northern Michigan. And on the right, this is after it swept through about 10 to 12 years later. And what you see is just a dramatic decrease in the overall amount of ash phloem that's out there to support beetles. So there's another site that I'm just not showing here for the sake of simplicity, but what the authors found is that there's about an 87% reduction in ash basal area in this site here that we're looking at right here. And then in their other site in central Michigan, it was even closer to 100% at 97% reduction. So this is reflecting in my mind that initial wave of invasion as it rippled through Michigan. And also what we're seeing here is that these are stands that were dominated by green and black ash. So they're super susceptible. The beetles come through and the trees don't stand a chance. And unfortunately, many of the tall ones are killed. they made a special note from this study stating that nearly all of the green and black ash that were bigger than 13 centimeters, which, if I'm doing my math right, is about 4 to 5 inches or so. So basically, all of the overstory trees were totally dead in this stand. So not everything is dead because they still had the little trees popping up from the understory. But when we think about the big trees, nearly all of them are dead. So very bleak when we look at what's going on with green and black ash. Now, this gets to another interesting point to talk about is that because EAB populations or EAB had a nearly infinite food resource when it arrived in North America, the populations kind of exploded like crazy. But of course, they are depleting their food resource as they are here. So the number of trees, so trees have died over time. EAB is a beetle that is reproducing every year. So eventually what would happen is that we would expect the EAB population to decline as well because they're using up all of their food resources. And generally speaking, what we find in post-invasion stands, places where EAB has been around for a long time, is that the populations of the beetles are generally operating below carrying capacity, meaning that there's more food available for them to feed and that the population level is below what the area could support. So that study we just talked about from the previous slide, I'll talk about this graph in a minute here. From the previous slide, that reduction in carrying capacity is almost 99%, depending on how you do the math. And that's because, as you saw in that image there, all of the overstory trees are dead. So that's just a dramatic reduction in the food resource able to support the beetles out there in these forests. And so these folks, the Robinette et al. Study, which is what this graph is from, they did some trapping in forests in central Michigan where EAB had been around for a long time. And what this graph is showing you here is that generally speaking, they're not collecting a lot of beetles and that there's a very weak relationship between the number of beetles and the number of ash phloem area present within a forest. And they also found that the canopies in these forests were generally healthy. So all of this is to say is that the beetles kind of peaked in abundance because they ate everything that they could. They exploded in number, and then there was a bit of a crash. The numbers went down a lot because they depleted their food resource. And now ash is still out there, but it's not really the thing that's limiting the population number of these beetles. And so this is something that a lot of folks are concerned about is that, well, are we going to see another rise in EAB populations as these little trees that were spared the last time around get bigger and become part of the canopy? And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on further here, but that is kind of a big unanswered question in this realm of study. So another and very important question is that, okay, so if EAB is killing a lot of our overstory trees, are the ash able to live at least long enough to produce seeds to contribute to regeneration, to support the next cohort that's going to fill up into the canopy? And yeah, maybe they die really soon, but if they're able to reproduce, then ash is at least going to hang around and be a part of our forests. So these folks were interested in this question and they used FIA data from the Forest Service, which is it stands for Forest Inventory and Analysis Program that the Forest Service does on roughly a decade-based basis throughout the United States. This map on the right here is showing where they collected their data from. And then the colors here represent where or when EAB invaded these different places that the data that they collected came from. So they got this big data set about, tree regeneration, the health of the overstory, and so on and so forth from all these places in Eastern North America. And then they divided the data into these invasion cohorts. So everything that's in the 2002 to 2006 block here, that's when it was invaded in that part of the country, and so on and so forth with the other colors. And then this graph on the left here is showing you again density. So these are the number of trees on a per hectare basis. And here they're looking at recruitment versus mortality for each of these cohorts. So these are data collected from 2002 to 2007. And on the x-axis, it's showing you when EAB invaded each of those trees that are plotted on the right here. So the way to make sense of this graph is that in 2002 to 2006, when EAB is first arriving in the 2002 to 2006 region, the vast majority of the understory trees are able to make it into the overstory and become recruited into the canopy. So that's what we mean by recruitment. And a small fraction of them are dying just due to the various things that kill trees out in nature. And if we look at the other cohorts that were invaded much later on, similar data trends, the trees are generally all becoming part of the canopy and some of them are dying. Now, when we look later on in time, so we look at the next time point, here we're looking at these same groups of trees, but we're looking at the data that was collected by the Forest Service a decade later, give or take a few years. And so what we see here is that 2002 to 2006 cohort, the majority of the trees are dying and far fewer of them are becoming part of the overstory. And that makes sense if we think about the fact that EAB has been present here for, roughly a decade or so, give or take a few years at this point in time. So what that means is that lots of those overstory trees are dying. Those recruits aren't necessarily becoming part of the overstory because they die before they get to that point. But nonetheless, even though mortality is outpacing recruitment here, there are still some trees that are getting bigger. And then if we look at the other cohorts, it's the same thing. EAB hasn't been there for as long, so we're kind of getting close to the point for the 2007 to 2012 part, where mortality would outpace recruitment, but we're not quite there yet. And then the 2013 to 2018, EAB has just arrived there, so things are still business as usual. So this is really concerning if you see a graph like that because it looks like, well, all the ash is going to die before it becomes part of the canopy. And the big concern here is that ash can take a long time before it's mature enough to produce seeds. There's not a lot of research on this topic, and so I think that this is still something that needs to be investigated a little bit better. But generally speaking, depending on what species you're talking about, it can take anywhere from 6 to 20 years before ash are old enough to produce seeds. But as a caveat to that, I will say that in our study, we found plenty of recruits these are trees that are smaller than 10 centimeters. Um, we found that about 32% of them, of all of our trees that had seed, about 32% of those seed-bearing trees were recruits. So little trees can still produce seeds and contribute to the next generation. They don't necessarily all have to be mature overstory trees. So that's my caveat there to give you a little bit of hope. So, with our EAB dynamics over time, the big concern here is that if EAB is going to follow the same population trends we see in predator-prey relationships and other plant and animal taxa. So in Isle Royale in Michigan, the Park Service there has been monitoring populations of wolves and moose over time. And as you see, the moose is the key prey item for the wolves. So in periods of time when the moose population peaks, the wolf population tends to peak soon afterwards, but then all the moose resource gets used up, so then the wolf population tends to crash. And there's this cyclical state of equilibrium as they both tend to go up and down over time, but generally they all kind of hang around a central value, which is what we would refer to as the population equilibrium. Now, what we don't know with EAB and ash is if we're ever going to get to a cycle like this with EAB, or if EAB is going to explode so much so that it kind of drives ash to extinction. So that's kind of one really big unknown that depends on several factors, which we'll talk about going forward here. The one saving grace is that there's lots of things in North America that want to kill EAB, and our woodpeckers in particular do a really great job of killing larvae. Depending on where you are and the time of day, sometimes you can find woodpeckers kill up to about 50% of the larvae within trees, although generally speaking, from my experience, it's closer to about 30% or so most of the time. But nonetheless, that's still far fewer larvae that are completing development and emerging. These are some of the species that do this up in Michigan. It hasn't really been well studied in other parts of the country. But nonetheless, even though this is great, it's still not enough to protect trees from dying. But it's great that we have these woodpeckers out there. So this is what, the ash blinding, as we refer to, looks like when you've got a tree like the one on the left there. That's one that's had the bark ripped off more recently than one on the right. And each one of those peck marks is where a larva was pulled out of the tree. We also have three species of parasitoids that the government has been releasing for a number of years now. These are parasitoids that only target EAB in its native range. So we brought them over here to reduce the populations in the US. Typically, what we find is that these parasitize about 10 to 30% of larvae in stands where they've been established. The bad news is that it tends to take a long time for them to become widely established. Um, we're talking about, 4 to 5 years or so before you start seeing a really noticeable impact on the EAB populations. But again, maybe it takes a while, but that's still, in my mind, a good thing because it's like, yeah, maybe it takes a while to get going, but once they get going, you can see a direct benefit. As an example of that, we did a project down here in central Kentucky. And as part of that project, we collected parasitism data by these wasps on EAB larvae. We were focusing on Tetrasticus and Spatheus here, so their bottom two species. And we found about 20% parasitism by these species on average from our trees. And what's notable is that neither of these was released in the county that we collected data within. So, these species had to have dispersed a pretty long distance to get here and to parasitize such a high number of larvae. Now, Tetrasticus at this point in time had been released in Kentucky, but Spatheus had not been. So that's suggesting that it's spilling over from neighboring states and spreading throughout here. So nonetheless, it's not all doom and gloom. These things are likely contributing to the regulation of EAB and those predator and prey dynamics, and ultimately how the population will fare into the future. One question you may have, and I promise I'll finish up soon here. I've got about 5 minutes left. One question that remains is that, well, if it takes a long time for ash to regenerate, what is filling the gaps in the meantime where ash declines in the canopy? And this is a question that a lot of people have looked at, and we have a few sort of answers, but no real general consensus yet. We tried to look at this with our data set, and what we found is that for red oak and basswood, they were more prevalent where there was less ash basal area. So that's what these graphs are showing you here. Essentially, the further left you are, the less ash there are, and the more of these two species there are. But we didn't find a relationship with respect to dead ash densities. So we didn't find it where there was lots of dead ash that there was more of these species. So this suggests to me that at these sites that we sampled at, they kind of like different conditions and were more established in different soil types, different canopy conditions, and so on, rather than EAB killed all the trees and that these things sprung up where the EAB killed the trees. So nonetheless, though, from studies that other folks have done, which I'm just going to go over fairly quickly here, these are the species that are generally expected to fill those canopy gaps by kind of growing outwards or, accelerating their growth from the understory into the overstory. It's very common eastern species like American elm, black cherry, our various maples, and our red oaks. So we found lots of these at the sites that we surveyed, and although our data don't seem to indicate that they're filling the gaps created by ash, it would make perfect sense if they were. What is interesting is that if you think about a riparian zone where species like green and black ash especially really like the conditions there, these authors looked at this because they were interested in what's happening where green and black ash decline next to a stream. And so they did this in northern Michigan. And what they found is that in places where the canopy had basically, filled up with dead trees and lots of light was hitting the ground, what they found is that these areas were dominated by these sedges that were growing up, filling in those spots. And what's the concern here is that these sedges may prevent ash from being able to grow up when they're very young seedlings because they're just kind of shading the the they're preventing light from reaching the seedlings that are popping up from below those sedges. So that's the concern there. This obviously isn't going to happen everywhere. This is mostly a wetland issue, but nonetheless, it is something to think about and something that I think deserves further study to see how dramatic the impact this might be on black and green ash. So, to wrap up here, this question of will ash hang around in the future is complicated, as I hope you've come to appreciate by the end of this talk. when we talk about white and blue ash, things generally look pretty good for the most part. We see a lot of regeneration. Yeah, there's pretty high mortality for white ash, but for the most part, it's doing all right. When we look at green and black ash, things don't look so good. And I would say that if you have a place where there's lots of green and black ash and you want to keep them around, it's in your best interest to either do some parasitoid releases, contact the Forest Service to do that, or treat a set proportion of the trees in your stand with an insecticide like amamectin benzoate to protect those trees for 2 to 3 years. I didn't present on these data, but we have a long-term project that we're wrapping up right now where we're looking at the combined effect of parasitoid releases with treating a set proportion of a stand with insecticides. And so far, it seems like these two things synergize and give you added bang for your buck, but stay tuned for the full story on that. Hopefully, I can present that here in a year or two. Um, and then in terms of what's going to happen in the future, what we hope is going to happen, and again, I don't know, I can't predict the future, but what we hope is that parasitoids and woodpeckers eventually reduce EAB from being such a damaging pest and increase the rate at which ash can regenerate and reduce overall mortality of those mature seed-bearing trees. And then that's where I'll say too that even if you treat a small proportion of ash in a stand, whatever your budget allows for, you can have a noticeable impact on EAB populations and in turn support the health of neighboring untreated trees as a result of just lowering the overall population. So I would just like to thank the many, many people at the Forest Service and at Michigan State who helped with this project. Their help was greatly appreciated. We worked out in the woods for many hot and sweaty days where we were getting destroyed by mosquitoes and poison ivy to bring this data to you today. So I'm very grateful for their assistance. And then I'll close in saying that if you have any questions, just put them in the chat, and I think Bob will get to them. And if you want to reach out to me, you can email me. The paper that I talked about today that we did is that's the title there at the bottom. It's on my lab website and freely accessible. I also have a short outreach article where I summarize those findings as well. And then here, these are some parasitized EAB, well, what once was EAB larvae that have turned into some parasitoid cocoons to give you some flavor to look at there. And so, yeah, we'll take any questions in the time left.
All right, thank you very much, Caleb. So for our first question we have, someone is asking, do the Manchurian ashes play well with others? Are they used by native species for food, habitat, etc., or could they replace the
Mhm.
native ashes ecologically?
That's a great question, and I don't believe that they're invasive. I suspect that's probably the biggest concern. I don't believe they're invasive, but to be honest, I don't know a lot about the species-specific requirements for that species. But I don't believe they're invasive. I've not heard of them being an invasive species, so I would think in like an ornamental setting, like somebody's yard, I think it would be fine to plant them. But that is a valid concern and something certainly worth looking into.
All right, so our next question, can you talk a little bit more about what a 2-year cycle looks like with emergence and flight, etc.? Most of the work I've encountered talks about them as a 1-year cycle. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on cold weather impacts for EAB.
Yeah, whether or not like a really intense winter kills some of them, I mean, it doesn't really seem to be the case because they do pretty well all throughout where they've been found in North America and in Asia. They can be found as far north as the Russian Far East. So I mean, maybe like a really intense winter could kill some of them, but for the most part, I don't think winter mortality is a big contributing factor. And then in terms of the population cycle, essentially what happens that is that they don't become pupae. And so the females lay eggs on the trees, the larvae hatch, they burrow their way inside the tree, they chew around for a little bit, and then but they don't molt into those later instars. They kind of just hang out, and then the following year, once it warms up again, they resume feeding, and then they will emerge that following year. So basically, instead of emerging the following spring, they'll stick in the tree for another winter and then come out the following spring and complete their development at that point in time. So yeah, that's a really interesting area of study that I've only briefly dabbled in, but it is, for whatever reason, temperature dependent, and it seems like it's much more common the further north or the further you are into a temperate or Arctic climate.
So our next question is there any idea why some ash trees are as badly affected? Are EAB laying eggs on them less? Are the trees more able to defend themselves, or maybe the environment that those trees prefer is worse for EAB?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. It's I mean probably a bit of all of those things. There has been some research into the actual like what's happening inside the tree to protect it. And essentially what you'll find sometimes on a white ash is that you'll be peeling the bark back and you'll see a gallery that was started and then it just kind of fizzles out and goes nowhere and it just kind of ends in a fine point. So like the larva never got past the second instar. So generally speaking, there is something going on biochemically within the plant, and this is something that folks are looking into. People have like identified certain genes associated with resistance, certain metabolites within the plant. And I'm not enough of a plant biochemistry person to tell you all the nitty-gritty ways in which that works, but essentially, these chemicals are much more prevalent in a thing like blue ash or Manchurian ash, that when the EAB encounter them, they're much more likely to die and not develop very farther. Um, Whether or not there's some sort of non-preference, like they don't want to lay eggs on those trees to begin with, I don't know. That could certainly be a contributing factor. For things like black and green ash, they don't have those chemical defenses to begin with, so that's a problem. And then for green or for black ash in particular, it will grow in stands of nothing but black ash and what we call these black ash swamps in places like northern Michigan or Maine, or also in Minnesota, they've got a lot of them. So that's a problem too, because you've got a really susceptible plant and then there's millions of other ones surrounding it in all directions. So it really kind of cascades and makes the damage far worse than it would be if there was, some varying disruption in terms of other host species surrounding it. That's something that we have looked at with our research to see, like in forests where there's more tree species, is it harder for the EAB to find trees and infest them? And generally speaking, it doesn't really seem like that's the case. What they do seem to hone in on are the volatiles that the trees produce, and they can kind of smell their way to where ash are. But they're very good dispersers, so they can fly a really long distance, but they do tend to search out stands where you've got clumps of ash together. If you've got an isolated tree out by itself somewhere, it generally seems to be a little bit less likely to be colonized, but again, since they're so good at spreading around, it's just that one chance occurrence of them landing on that tree is all it really takes for things to take off from there.
Okay, I think we got time for one more question here. Someone is asking, are the S-shaped galleries related to tree defense? Why do they make that feeding pattern? And
Hmm.
does the tree constrain their ability to feed over the place, or is it a density thing?
In terms of the winding galleries, I can't, I mean, honestly, I can't say. I'm not sure if that's what that's related to. Maybe it's just due to water and nutrients moving through the tree that makes certain wood a little bit softer to chew on, and so they change direction to feed on that. Um, I don't think the larvae are competing with each other, generally speaking. The only place that that ever occurs is when they first arrive in an area, especially if you've got a lot of really susceptible trees like black ash, where there'll be so many larvae all feeding on the same tree that they will actually compete with one another for galleries or for space essentially. So maybe that's part of it. Like it's like a ingrained behavior that they've carried with them. I can't speak to that. And then what was the second part of that question, Bob?
It looks like they're asking, does the tree constrain their ability to feed over that place or that area, or is it related to density? Probably wondering if the tree is limiting their ability to feed, which is forcing them into that S-shaped pattern, or is it due to population density of the larvae in the tree, I think is what they're asking.
Yeah, I mean, both of those things can contribute. Like a tree that's like half dead and it's got a lot of dead wood inside the tree, they'll kind of run into that, change direction, and go back to where there's fresher wood to feed on. So yeah, it is both of those things, but generally the population dependent effect only is found where they're outbreaking.
All right, I see we have a few more questions here. We are real close to two. I'm gonna go ahead and cut it now. I can get those questions to Caleb if you want. Just email
Yeah,
them to me. With that, though, thank you everyone. Appreciate your attendance. We're going to be doing this again next week. I think same day, same time, going over beech leaf disease. So I hope to see you all there. Other than that, everybody have a great afternoon, and I will see you next week.